Faculty of English at the University of Richmond in Virginia, and I am at the Birdhouse Market, and this is Day 7 of Richmond Public Library's 100 Days RVA Reads, a program promoting the Great American Read by PBS WCVE. And I am going to be discussing Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, that came out in 1987. And a few years ago, I read a list that a newspaper had asked American critics and academics and writers to name the most important novels of the last 100 years. And Toni Morrison's Beloved was #1 on that list by so many votes that there was a world of difference between #1 and #2. And as a English professor who regularly teaches this book, I can't agree more. And I think one of the things to understand about the book, which is not widely taught in high schools, in AP programs, and at universities, in English departments, is that it's a really violent book. And one of the things that's amazing about this book is the way that it forces people who don't necessarily learn the history of slavery in the United States and some of the specific laws governing the movement of slaves in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. But it forces them to think about how violent American history has been. So, at the center of this book is the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which essentially made slavery legal throughout the entirety of the United States. Even in free states, people were compelled by act of Congress to return freed slaves to their quote-unquote owners here in the South. And so the book is about a former slave named Seth, who gets out of slavery and has a few children and has settled in the North and is making a life for herself after slavery. And in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, her former owner and a group of 3 other white men come charging in on horses to her property and try to steal her back into slavery. And the difficulty of the book is that rather than allow her children to be brought back into slavery, Setha murders her own child in the back of the house behind the shed. And a lot of the book is really wrestling with that moral decision, that we have to understand, especially at maybe this historical moment, when politicians talk about how slavery really wasn't that bad, that it was so horrific that it may actually have been the best thing for a mother to do to love her children, to kill them, rather than allow them to be brought back into slavery. So that's the violent center of this book that I think people really wrestle with. But what makes it really interesting formally is that it's maybe the most important of what are often called neo-slavery. So if you think back to the 18th and 19th centuries, a lot of freed slaves were encouraged by abolitionists to write their own autobiographies, and they would write these very realist stories. Here's where I was born, here were the conditions on the plantation, here's how I got away, and here's why we should think about abolishing slavery. And a lot of those books, if you read them, The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass is maybe the most commonly taught of these, but a lot of them had to do with an insistence on realism and truth. And so in Douglass's narrative, for instance, you get white abolitionists writing these prefaces saying, you should trust this. I know this person, every word of this is real. Right? William Lloyd Garrison says this represents slavery as it is, all caps. By the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of writers were trying to understand how telling a story in that realist way might not be the best way to help people really experience and think about the violence of slavery in the United States. And so the way that Toni Morrison does this is she tells that story, that horrific story, that you can tell in a realistic way, by making the book essentially a ghost story. And so the conceit of the book is that this child that Setha kills behind the shed comes back. At first she comes back literally as a haunted house. And as Setha and her other daughters live in this house and try to understand what's happening, eventually the ghostly presence becomes a real person that they call Beloved. And so, in a way, what the book, I think, is trying to get us to understand is that the violence never goes away, that it continues to haunt us and is always here, and always speaking to us, and always calling for our attention, and really our emotion. And I think it's despite all of that violence, or maybe because of it, it is just a profoundly gorgeous book. And there are sentences in it that make me weep how well they're written. So I know she won the Nobel Prize and does not need an additional recommendation. you are going to read one book this summer, I would highly recommend reading Beloved. So if you like what you heard, all 100 books are available at your local Richmond Public Library. Want to be a reader or find out where the next reading is? Visit rvalibrary.org/100days, or join us on our Facebook group, or subscribe to our YouTube channel at Richmond Public Library 100 Days. Richmond, let's read.
Yay! That was so good!
Yeah.